What is up, horror and science fiction fans? It is Danny and Pete from the Lassercast, and we are joined by David Weiner, once again, friend of the channel, the director of In Search of Darkness 1 and 2, and now you bring us In Search of Tomorrow, 4 hours and 45 minutes plus of 80s science fiction goodness. David, how you doing? And tell us about the project and all the fundraising info that we need to know.
Well, happy to be here. Happy to be back with you guys. And well, let's see. I did 2 horror movies, part 1 and part 2 of 80s horror, with a third on the way, as you guys well know. But when we were doing In Search of Darkness, Robin Block, who is the mastermind behind all of this, he's just like, we just did an action one. We're working on a horror one, sci-fi, 80s sci-fi. That's like the next logical step. And I said, ding, that keep on checking my boxes, sir. Keep on checking my boxes. And so I'm a lover of all different genres. And so once we completed In Search of Darkness and In Search of Darkness Part 2, which both ended up being 4.5 hours long, structured 1980 to 1989, a number of movies within each year, and then a chapter in between, larger context topics and discussion, multiple people, 50, 60 people or more, from the era, icons of the era, in front of the camera, behind the camera, inspired by all that stuff. Like, let's bring that formula over and just keep on going, because everyone seems to be very receptive to that, the people who get it. There are plenty of people who are like, why isn't this a series, or why do I have to sit so long? And those are valid questions, but we could talk about that stuff later. But ultimately, here we are, In Search of Tomorrow, a movie that took longer to make because we shot it during some inconvenient COVID something or other that, I don't know, some people might have been affected by. It affected us, so it took a while. So very proud to have this movie finally out. And we could talk about again later, but I'll just say you can get it now through March 27th. If you go to 80sci-fi.com, go to that site. That's the only way you can get it. Can't get it streaming, can't get it at the store. That's how you get not only the movie, digital copy, physical copy on DVD or Blu-ray, but you also get your name in the credits, or your podcast in the credits, whatever you like. And you get to be proud to help shepherd this thing into its life.
Well, I am really glad that people are shepherding this project, because this is like just a trip down memory lane, and it's just like the best of the best. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You said that it's multiple hours long, but it's like, it never feels like it's dragging, and there's not a single part that I would hope that you would omit. I think there's like a lot more I'd like to include in there, and I just think it was fantastic. I was thinking, we've watched In Search of Darkness for our channel. For In Search of Tomorrow, there seems to be like a different kind of tone, right? The formula is the same for the documentaries, but the tone seems different. There seems to be like a little bit more of a reverence for science fiction, whereas in the horror movies, it's more like people are talking about having a good time, enjoying those movies. I was kind of thinking of like a metaphor. It's kind of like sci-fi is like the nerdy uncle that like, got the girl and made a ton of money when they got older. But horror is kind of like the uncle that's like at the part-time job trying to really focus on their metal band, And so I was wondering, did you ask the same kind of questions during In Search of Tomorrow? Or, and you got different responses from the people? Or did you ask different types of questions?
My first question out of the gate was, which uncle are you? Are you the nerdy uncle with the hot chick who, after your midlife crisis, you did well for yourself by now getting into the NFT game? That was really my question. And I didn't want to offend anyone else, because, listen, sometimes you just got to make a living however best you can. Yes. In all seriousness, to answer your question, there's a bit of a formula in terms of the way we get into these things that I found was working with In Search of Darkness, in terms of getting the nostalgic juices flowing. And so I wait before I get anywhere near talking about somebody's project. So if I'm talking to, Peter Weller about RoboCop. I'm not going to be talking about RoboCop for a little while. We're going to talk about the broader themes to get their juices flowing. But very similar to In Search of Darkness, I always out of the gate talk about their memories of the movies that made them. And so, what is your favorite horror movie? Or in this case, what is your favorite sci-fi movie growing up that made a real influence on you and impacted your life, and may or may not have driven you to seek out more sci-fi in a different way? And I find even if someone is not really that into sci-fi, there's always that one that's like, oh yeah, The Day the Earth Stood Still, or Invaders from Mars, or Star Wars, whatever it is. There's that one movie where it just transcends the genre as something that really made an impact and helped shape their perception of what sci-fi can be. And to also dive into what you're talking about a little bit, when it comes to these different uncles you're talking about, it's really a different tone for this film, because there's more of an intellectual element as well as a heartfelt element to these movies. And that's not to say that doesn't belong in horror as well, but horror is more of an emotional, knee-jerk, kinetic reaction to the type of material. And then you could talk about the themes and what it means. But whereas you're talking about sci-fi, that's really the kind of first thing you start thinking about. The emotion kind of comes second, whereas horror, the emotion comes first. It sort of flips it around. So the approach to whether you're talking about a specific movie or how these movies are made, the approach is slightly different. The movie segments are all a little bit longer because they take a little more time to kind of break down the different elements we have available from the talent talking about it and recontextualizing it decades later. So yeah, this is a little bit a different movie, but I'll add one last thing, is that the nostalgia here seems to be a lot more potent than the other films in just a different way. In that there's much more at heart with all these movies than I suspected. These movies meant so much to me, and I hope my passion for all of this genre, which is a very wide-ranging genre, I think it comes through because I love it so much. But I think in dissecting the various pieces that make us describe our interest in finding out more about sci-fi and what these movies that inspired us and then inspired us to find out more about them, whether we read about it in magazines, we would seek out the poster, we would consume the marketing, we just wanted more, and it's as much the video store experience or buying a magazine to find out more, or listening to the soundtrack, or playing with the toys, whatever have you may have, whatever you had in your life to expand your experience of taking the film home with you. With back in the day, you couldn't do that, so you did everything else to compensate. That, I think, is really connecting with a lot of people watching this.
Yeah,
I feel like you just answered my follow-up question in a way, but kind of keeping on that same idea. I wrote this quote down from Kerry O'Quinn, who ran Starlog magazine. He said sci-fi is more about the possibilities than the dangers. And as somebody who Pete's more of the sci-fi person, I'm more of the horror person. I think we both love and respect each genre, but I'm more horror, he's more sci-fi. I took that quote, and my first thought was, horror is the exact opposite. Horror is all about the dangers and like walking into the dangers, and we want to see the dangers, not really caring about the possibilities so much. And I was going to ask you about some of those similarities and differences, but what is it about these two genres that one of them is all about possibilities, one of them's all about like the danger and the end result usually, that they're so similar? I mean, I'm wearing a Thing shirt. The Thing is prominently featured in both of your documentaries because it is horror, but it's also sci-fi. And so what is it about these two genres that are like just forever linked?
Well, what's an interesting way of looking at it is sometimes the macro or the approach, whether it's a micro view or a macro view, chosen by the filmmaker. So take Alien, for example. Alien is about all sorts of things, blue collar workers, space travel, science experiments and possibility, and the potential for corporate greed and bioweapons. That's all there, but it's also just a haunted house movie in space where the monster's going to get you and you're scared crap, shitless about that stuff. It allows both. The Thing allows both because it's really just a bunch of people and paranoia, but it's also about who's the thing and who's not. And coming to the realization, it dawns on you that if you don't squash this now, maybe at the expense of your own life, this is going to be the end of the world in this tiny, remote, Arctic station, So there's different ways of approaching these stories, but it's storytelling. But it's storytelling on an intellectual level that is either overt or more subtle. But I think sci-fi really, in general, invites you to think about the possibilities, both positive and negative, the ramifications of decisions, both positive and negative. And I think that's why, you can love horror and you can love sci-fi, you can love just as much equally. But I think it takes a different mindset to appreciate one versus the other. You kind of switch your brain to a little more, like I said, it's not black and white, but one's a little more intellectual, one's a little more visceral.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because the way that the movie sets it up is that there seem to be a lot more sort of negative sci-fi movies in prior decades of like the negative consequences of humans using science. And then all of a sudden in the 80s, you have, America trying to kind of rebuild itself, and Star Wars kind of paved the way in the late 70s. And so there's this whole idea that you present in this documentary that the public was sort of looking for uplifting sci-fi and just kind of went all in with some of these really positive movies. And what's interesting about this documentary is that I feel like for me and Danny, like Danny just said, we kind of had the inverse experience, whereas like in Search of Darkness, he probably have seen most of the movies, or at least knew about most of the movies. Whereas with this movie, I felt like I've seen about 90% of the movies in this documentary. And there's only about 4 that I had never even heard of before, but I remember seeing them as a kid. And so that's what I was kind of wondering about, because I know that with In Search of Darkness, like the sequels, you get more and more obscure. With this movie, was there like a real goal to just pick the kind of shining examples? Because I know that like sci-fi fans are very outspoken, and maybe they would have been like, oh, you didn't include RoboCop, or oh, you didn't include Star Trek, 2, So was there a goal to just focus on the shining examples?
Well, when you make these movies that, are 4 to 5 hours long, and you think it's going to include everything, and then that one thing that you wanted isn't there, and you say, how could you not have that in there? It's damned if you do, damned if you don't. The problem is there's so much great stuff in that decade. The 80s just has so many amazing films, but there's also a whole different approach to how films were made, because you've got the theatrical, big budget, highly marketed, very commercial stuff. And then you have a whole other level of straight to video, because the video explosion in the 80s allowed filmmakers like, Roger Corman to just go, well, he would get theatrical stuff too, but a lot of stuff would go straight to video or be discovered for the first time on video. And straight to video was something that, if you had a knockoff Mad Max movie from Italy called BattleTruck, that's where you'd find it, because you could never find that in the theater. Here's the thing. This is the first movie about sci-fi that we're doing, and there are so many heavy hitters that if I selectively choose all of them, there's no room for the eclectic stuff. If I choose a lot of eclectic stuff, then you're going to say, why didn't you do this one? Why didn't you do that one? Right. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. I did a little bit of that. But the idea is, I'm very optimistic, because there's so much ground to cover. Easily could do part 2, part 3 if you want to. I figured you like the template for In Search of Darkness. You kind of do the commercial heavy hitter stuff first with some eclectic choices. And then if there's success and people want more, ideally, that's when I could really, go to town on some of these more eclectic titles, or unheard of titles, or foreign titles that no one's ever seen, but, or, few have seen. So It's really my approach. But the idea is I'm such a completist. I want it all in there. And when I did my rough cut, the rough cut went easily another 90 minutes when I just had to stop because I could have kept on going with all the material I've got. And I just had to. Some of the really well-known films that we won't name them here, so I want some surprises, But some of the really well-known films, I had segments cut and ready to go, and I just said, I got to mix and match. I got to see how it all fits together. It's a big jigsaw puzzle, and I do want to tell a story here. So ideally, it all starts in part 2.
Excellent.
Pete, I think what Dave is saying is Transformers will be in the sequel. Relax.
I know. Listen, I thought of you very specifically, Pete, and I dreaded this moment because I was going to have to let you down somehow. Because I remember you were like, I want Transformers, and it's going to be in there. And I trust you, my friend. I worked hard to make sure that it happened. But there was certain talent that I was trying to get a hold of that wasn't available. Remember, this is a COVID era film. So there are a lot of people who might have been available or said that they were available, and then we stopped. And then when we started up again, it was like, who's the groundhog or the meerkat popping up their head saying, I'll go out and do an interview. We did a lot of interviews outside so we could have, airflow and that kind of stuff. But, the way it worked with some of the talent, and we have 70 plus people in this movie, just really great people who are just icons of the era. Sometimes you want someone who can represent a film. And if you can't get that person because they're not available, or they say, sure, but I'm busy because all of a sudden, after not working for months and months and months, I'm in high demand. Sometimes at a certain point, you just have to draw a line. So that is my humble apology, sir.
David, I think this is an obvious direction to go to in terms of questioning, given current events. But so much of 80s sci-fi, especially the early 80s sci-fi, is steeped in the Cold War. And here we are, it's 2022, we're 30 plus years later. Russia and Ukraine are in the middle of a conflict. My students are asking me every day if World War III is about to start. And I'm like about a month away from teaching the Cold War in my classes. So do you think from a science fiction perspective, do you think that we could see a revival of the type of science fiction that we saw in the 80s, given what we're seeing in the world right now?
Yeah. If you think about it, separate from a Cold War era style film, we already have a myriad pandemic style films in the works. Think about it, and this is sort of not sidestepping, this is sort of a sidebar of that question. But if you think about television and commercials in the past 2 years with the COVID era, where you get to a point where you're watching television and you'd have crowds of people together without masks, and you thought to yourself, oh, that's crazy, but then all of a sudden you have some commercials where people are showing up at your door wearing masks, or people are walking into places wearing masks. And I'm just talking about myself. I vax and I wear my mask, and my first thought was, I don't want to see masks. That's ruining the illusion that I don't want to be reminded of what I'm really living through right now. Mm-hmm. Same thing now with the Cold War. When I revisited so many of these films, I was born in 1968, so I was a 70s kid and an 80s teen. And I had happily repressed the memories of daily thoughts of I'm going to be obliterated at the push of a button one day, potentially. But that was a thing that my whole generation and people older and younger than me lived with daily back then. And when I revisited these films and this era of films, it really came back to me. I was like, there was a lot more addressing these issues in either heroic ways or in, dystopian or apocalyptic ways or post-apocalyptic ways, where most of our entertainment was either wish fulfillment, what if, or worst case scenario that really wove in a lot of these themes about nuclear Armageddon. James Cameron had, a nuclear explosion, or Skynet, or, in many of his films. We had The Day After, which was a TV movie that Nicholas Meyer, who went on to direct, Time After Time, and Star Trek Wrath of Khan and Star Trek films. These were things that were incredibly, incredibly potent in our lives that we had to just deal with. And we have a lot of people who lived in the era before me when they were having to do duck and cover drills at school, and talking as adults at how ridiculous that was, because like duck and cover, really, that's going to protect you from a nuclear war. Good luck, Contemporary films these days, I'm sure, will kind of bring some of these things back, because contemporary films reflecting the times, especially with science fiction, whether it's another planet and aliens, or whether it's a what if scenario where someone presses the wrong button and you've got a chain of events where next thing you know, you have to grapple with the end of the world, and what do you do, and what would you do? That's always going to be around, because as long as we have authoritarian people running the show, it's always going to be this way, and it's very sad and depressing. And the last thing I want to do is be part of the zeitgeist. But I think it helps us grapple with what we're dealing with in the present day. And the least you could do is say, you're not alone. You can teach your students to just say, we dealt with this on a daily basis in previous generations. There was a stretch when it was more about afraid of terrorists coming in, or a gunman coming in, and we're all dealing with some pretty awful psychological trauma that we have to suppress or repress on a daily basis. And now we're, coming full circle with World War III. What can you do? You're powerless to do it. So the real story here is, how do you maintain your sanity? And maybe escapism with protagonists saving the day is a bit of a salve that we all need.
It's interesting that you say that we have these sort of modern fears that we are always dealing with in each generation, and yet like Star Trek itself represents like a optimistic future, this positive future. And it's real interesting, because I feel like your documentary focuses very heavily on Star Trek, because I mean you cover the Wrath of Khan, the search for Spock, the voyage home, and you also kind of talk about Star Trek a lot in terms of the Challenger explosion and kind of the space shuttle and Star Trek's connection as well. So I was wondering, was that an intentional choice to focus on the Star Trek trilogy that's in the early 80s versus Star Wars? I know that you have Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi in the 80s as well, and Star Wars gets so much attention. Were you really trying to showcase Star Trek a lot?
Sure. Well, I'm a Trekkie through and through. Here, look behind me. There you go.
Of course,
there's the Enterprise right there. For those listening, I've got a Star Trek The Motion Picture poster behind me. I love both equally. I like to joke that my life is that meme with the boyfriend who gets distracted by the girl, and my girlfriend is Star Trek, and then Star Wars walks by, and I'm like, woo, what's that? But that's kind of how things work for me. But in the 80s, there were more Star Trek films than there were Star Wars films. Mm-hmm. Star Wars came out in 77, Empire came out in 80, Return of the Jedi came out in 83. Star Trek 2, Star Trek motion picture came out in 79, 2 weeks before, 1980. So it gets some lip service, but we're talking about 2, 3, and 4. I had a 5 already cut, and I decided not to continue with it just because I figured we had plenty of Star Trek with it. Star Wars kind of hogs all the glory, but Star Trek 2 arguably does too as well. But when you have people representing those films with really interesting things to say, and those films really punctuate the decade with their consistency. And also, if you take Star Trek 2, 3, and 4, Will Wheaton, who's one of our talent who talks about stuff, he points out that is like the ultimate sort of trilogy within a bunch of sequels of films. Mm-hmm. That's a sort of a contained story that was doing that, that kind of, continued storytelling way before we had it elsewhere, in the Marvel, shared universe and so on and so forth. So I think it was it is doing Star Trek a disservice if I don't put 2, 3, and 4 together in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's okay to omit 5. I know that's not everybody's cup of tea. I know as a complete
bite your tongue. It might be the best for some people. Listen,
Okay,
all these movies are very important for everybody. And all I could say about Star Trek 5 is, Star Trek 5 is essentially, the sort of butt of many Star Trek jokes in terms of the series. But I've got some really great stories about why Star Trek 5 did not do as well as the others, and it has a lot to do with production problems. And that's a really interesting story. Much like when I go into stories like Howard the Duck or Mac and Me, which are also punchlines, there's some interesting, compelling stories about why these films did not, ace the box office or, turn out to be a great film, but they're still an interesting story, lined with very good intentions. So Star Trek is similar in terms of Star Trek 5. And you'll have to wait for another In Search of Tomorrow to find out.
Right.
I was really interested in obviously to talk about Superman 2 and the whole director switch. And I remember I messaged Pete and I said I want to ask David. I can't imagine, because everybody, I don't want to say everybody, most people, when asked what's your favorite Superman movie, I think the consensus is probably part 2 is the best of the films. Maybe the original, but a lot of people love part 2. I just have this feeling that because it was the 80s, the whole director switch wasn't covered that much. Whereas today, that information would be blown up all over social media, and that movie would be like a failure upon failures, no matter how great it was, just because people would walk in ready to hate it. So can you just talk about like some of the stories like that from the 80s where in these films where something like that happens, a behind the scenes switch, and how that would like work today?
One of my guests, one of the talent on screen for this film is Craig Miller. And he was a publicist and a marketer and a writer. He's for Lucasfilm early, back in the day. So he was there at the earliest days of Lucasfilm. But he was also a marketing consultant for studios, so for like Warner Brothers and for Universal. And so he has some really interesting insight on Superman 2 about how back in the day they made sure that they cherry picked the right person who didn't have sour grapes about this whole situation, who could go on tour, that being Sarah Douglas, who plays Ursa, who's in our film talking about this. She said they really put her through the paces to see if she could tell a story without spilling the beans, because Christopher Reeve, Gene Hackman, Marco Kidder, they were all upset that Richard Donner lost his job and then couldn't finish the film, and they had to reshoot a bunch of the same scenes. Richard Lester picked up where Richard Donner left off and reshot a bunch of stuff. I really enjoyed Sarah Douglas's point of view about it. I won't spoil too much about it, but she shares how she felt about it. And I guess to answer your question is ultimately she was the one who went on tour around the world, supporting the film. And so you can guess what her take on it might have been. But ultimately, this was the pre-internet age. The studios controlled it a lot more, and you didn't have a bunch of people snapping pictures on set and leaking photos. Everything was just much more contained. And while we were all hungry for whatever we could get, we got that from Starlog magazine or Cinefantastique or whatever we could get. But other than that, the daily gossip column of, the daily news, or the Beagle, the Bugle, the Daily Bugle, whatever was talking about this stuff was the only place you can get it. I don't know. We were just as hungry then as we are hungry now, but I think we never had an opportunity to share our knee-jerk reactions to all this stuff and pigpile on a good idea, a bad idea, or just a knee-jerk reaction and make it about us. Back then, you responded to it, you talked about it, but you just had to wait till the movie to see what you got. And by the time you got the movie, you didn't have all these spoilers, and the trailers didn't give everything away more often than not. Sometimes they spoiled things. But at the end of the day, you just were happy to get the movie, and you showed up and you watched it. And I don't know, simpler times is all I could say. And then, get off my lawn.
I was just thinking about certain actors that we see multiple times in your documentary, but then you're not able to interview them because they've sadly passed on, right? And I was thinking about Bill Paxton in particular, right? Because Bill Paxton is in so many of the movies that you feature, but yet, he's not around anymore. And so, you have Aliens, and you have, he's in Terminator, he's in Weird Science, all these movies that are in your documentary. And I know that when you were doing the Aliens part, Sigourney Weaver mentions Bill Paxton's funeral. When it comes to these sort of actors that are just like such a big part of 80s sci-fi, were you like looking for little bits like that to kind of pay homage to these like really standout stars?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, a lot of it is just about what comes up in a conversation. I'm sitting down with Mark Rolston, who plays Drake, in Aliens. And, when I ask all about the making of the film and his experiences making the film, I'm as interested in talking about James Remar not being in the film, but being originally cast, right. Because he was there, he was doing boot camp, with James Remar before James Remar was recast. And you eventually go down the line, what was your memories or experiences with this person or that person. And Bill Paxton was, Mark Rolston says that Bill Paxton really kind of was the glue of that set, because he was everyone's pal and kept the mood light because it was very hard work. And he, after the movie ended, kept everyone together like a family, because movies are like a traveling circus. And you go from location to location and soundstage to soundstage, easy for me to say. But the thing is, you work really hard. You work 15, 18, 20 hours a day for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. Everyone becomes so close. And then there's that last day and you say, see ya, I'm off to another project. So let's get lunch on Monday. And then you never see him again. Or you run into him on something and you're like, oh, all the best intentions. But everyone knows that you come real close to these people and then you never see them again. Well, Bill Paxton was the guy who made sure everyone got together and had drinks and had lunch and had dinner and got together for events. And he was the glue for everybody. And so, yeah, he's sorely missed among many others, and he had a real impact on so many of the movies that we love. And it's great to hear these stories where the person was as wonderful as the person we admire on screen.
Pete just asked you about like working with, talking about these great actors who appear like Bill Paxton types who've sadly passed on. One person who you did get to interview and who's in the documentary several times is Ivan Reitman, who just passed away in February. Can you just talk about what it was like getting to sit down and talk to him? Because he was such a vital part of our childhood. Like, I grew up with Ghostbusters. I had a heavy metal poster on my wall. So that was one of those like celebrity deaths that, like, when it happens, it really hits you. Yeah.
We were very fortunate to have Ivan say yes. He was a wonderful interview. And I'll just say first and foremost, when I look at who I'm going to get in my film or try to get in my film, we're always aiming for the A-list and the top level folks. And you never know who's going to say yes or who's going to be available and who's not. And I think we got some really wonderful people. Ivan Reitman is one of those people where when he said yes, I was like, God, Ivan Reitman said yes. Yay. That's incredible. And for me, it's really cool because, yeah, we all know and love Ghostbusters. And of course, we're going to have Ghostbusters in this film. But for me, I'm like, yay, I get to talk to him about heavy metal. Yay, I get to talk to him about Space Hunter, Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, he was like, let's talk, Twins has sci-fi, let's talk about some of the sci-fi in Twins, because even though it's a comedy, science creates these mismatched twins. it was very, very cool. When I met him, he was incredibly gracious. I went to his home up in Montecito. And when I say home, he has quite the establishment that Ghostbusters built. But this guy's a legend. Stripes.
Meatballs.
Animal House, Meatballs. I mean, it just like huge, huge films that we all know and love and shaped our world. And it was just super cool. He was in perfect health when I was hanging out with him. He was incredibly gracious, and it makes this film that much more of a time capsule for the people who are in it, who have passed and who are alive. And it's that much more bittersweet that he was in our film and he's no longer with us. But I'm so grateful that he could be part of this, and I could have him talking about some of the things you might not expect him to talk about.
A big overarching theme in the documentary is how science fiction of the 80s predicted so much of what I guess we can call science fact today.
Right.
They bring up things like GPS. For one, that was like or Alexa, who I just said her name and the thing right behind me turned on. Oh crap! But like things in the 80s. Oh, quiet. The 80s sci-fi movies predicted all this stuff, and it's happening now. And so my question was, how wild is it for you to revisit these movies and see like the birth of modern technology? And is there one particular piece of modern technology that was like developed in the 80s that really stuck out to you talking about them and rewatching the movies?
I go straight to Running Man. It was very cool. When you go back and you first think about, okay, how does, the visions of technology. So you think, where's my flying car? Blade Runner, my spinner, where's my flying car? AI and androids and all that kind of stuff. That's like the far end of the spectrum of, we're not quite there yet, but we're trying. We're starting to do things. If you look at the stuff that Boston Dynamics is doing, it's equally astounding and frightening at the same time, where they're creating robot dogs and robot, humanoids moving around. But that being said, Running Man was probably the one film where I was just like, we're living in the Running Man age in a lot of ways, whether it's, deepfake technology or walking in and talking to, I won't say her name because she'll turn on over you, but, Siri or, the woman with the A name. But, it's like these movies were very prescient. They really some were visions of the future, some were predictions of the future, some are hopeful, some just think it's super cool. But it's like I grew up when the microwave was kind of new. It makes me sound like a fuddy-duddy now, but in the 70s, I don't know when the microwave really was first introduced, but it was mass produced in the 70s, where all of a sudden people were starting to get it in your kitchen and it wasn't like some high priced item. You have to remember, when all these things are introduced, they're very expensive at first, like the Betamax machine, or, your VCR is like a coffee table sized thing, but microwaves were just like, guess what? You don't have to wait all this time. Now you press 3 buttons and you can, have your toasted cheese sandwich in, 30 seconds. The technology that were in so many of these films, it really was visionary. And, I like to look at movies like Minority Report. Mm-hmm. And I feel like in a certain way, we're kind of living that already. I mean, I love this scene where Tom Cruise is walking through the mall, and everyone is being beamed into their eye. And they know exactly who they are, and they're immediately getting targeted ads right to them as they walk through the mall. And while we don't have that happening specifically where someone is targeting your face with recognition software and then, barking an ad at you, we've got that every single day on, as we surf the net, to the point where we all know it. And more often than not, I choose it because I'm like, well, I'd rather have ads for, cool collectibles than Depends diapers, because, maybe that market will change for me down the line, but I don't want collectibles, or I don't want, wax candles that smell like, body parts. So anyway, we live in a very amazing age. I marvel at the computer in my pocket and on my wrist. It's super cool, and technology can and should be feared, but it's really the people who are behind it and the nefarious ways that it's used versus the ways that it really benefits us. And I think it is the ultimate double-edged sword. And however you look at it, there's positive and there's negative, and you can't have one without the other. But it is part of our world now. And yeah, the 80s movies, they sure predicted a huge amount of what we've got today and around the corner.
Yes. And I'm really lucky, that you were able to coincidentally name our sponsors too, Depends Diapers and also those human body parts smelling candles. So thank you for putting that in there. But I was going to say, speaking of plugging, David, you are like so excellent at succinctly explaining all of your projects that you are in charge of and that you run. I've also been hearing about In Search of Legends. Are you're connected to that as well?
Yeah, Creator VC is the company that is Robin Bloch's company, who's the executive producer of all these films. It's a small company. We're worldwide. When I say we're worldwide, we have people in, in different countries around the globe, but we're still a small team of about 10 people. And we get a lot done. A small company with big projects. And so, yeah, we have lots of stuff in the works in the future. One of them is In Search of Legends, and that's about 80s fantasy films. So, whether you're talking about The Neverending Story or Conan the Barbarian, or Conan the Destroyer, or Red Sonja, or the
Legend.
The Legend with Tim Curry, Ridley Scott movie, and Tom Cruise and Mia Sara. So much great stuff that so many of us loved. It's ripe for the picking, Lady Hawk, whatever, what have you, there's all this amazing fantasy out there. Krull, it's a mix of action, sci-fi, and fantasy. A lot of these things have carryover, and yep, In Search of Legends is on the way. And In Search of Darkness, we want to do In Search of Darkness 90s, and we want to do In Search of Darkness 70s. I can't tell you what we're doing next because, believe it or not, we don't know. We're busy right now getting In Search of Tomorrow out there, but we're planting the seeds. And along with that, we also have another film that Creator VC is doing called FPS, which is first-person shooter about video games, and working on another one which is In Search of Pixels, which is all about the pixels, which is all about video game revolution. That one's in development as well. But FPS is in production right now. So that's a project that you can find out more and back that one if you're interested. And, what's really cool is everything that we do is relevant to what we believe our followers and our community and our fellow fans and super geeks like ourselves just love. And what makes us different is that we don't just crowdfund. We crowdfund our stuff, but we don't just crowdfund it and say, see you later, it'll be done when it's done, and then you can have it. We want everyone involved in the whole process, and we like to be transparent and talk about the project and answer questions and involve our community with ideas and suggestions. And it makes it for a very cool project because people feel like they're much more involved with their investment in shepherding a project over the finish line, and they have a say in the type of ultimate product that they're going to get, which is completely, designed for the fans and the fans who brought it into existence, from the crowdfunding get-go. So I think it's a super cool way of making movies because you get to make movies for everyone who wants them in the first place, and you can give them the kind of stuff that they want. And if there's too much to cover, ideally you keep on going in part 2 and part 3 and so on.
I was going to say, it feels like you and Robin Bloch are, and Creator VC, I feel like not too long into the future, there's going to be like the In Search of box set where there's the In Darkness 1 and 2 and 3, In Search of Tomorrow, Legends. There's the action movie doc that was done. Then you could do like In Search of Laughter about great 80s comedies. And, it's just fantastic. Like,
Robin, are you listening? He's already plotting out the blueprints of that box set.
But like, I think that speaks to I think that's one of the things about the 80s that is the most um, important for this time is we 80s kids really we grew up asking questions. We didn't have the internet, so like we were the ones who ran to the bookstore to get the magazines, and we want like we are the perfect generation to grab onto these 4 or 5 hour documentaries that give us everything we want to know. Whereas maybe like a kid born 10, 15 years later would just be like, I'll just Google it. But
Mhm.
I think that's why Pete and I especially appreciate like these documentaries so much. And I think that's why the crowdfunding has been there for you.
Well, your support means a lot to me and to us, and your feedback and your excitement about this stuff is something that we pay very close attention to. You know, we have a by the fans for the fans mentality, and this, like I said before, this is the kind of stuff that we love and we would want to see ourselves, and we put ourselves in a position to make these films.
I hope that for future generations that are not like us, that they pick up In Search of Tomorrow. I hope that they can see these original movies and not think, let's make a reboot of this, let's make a sequel to this, but instead like, oh, we should make a whole new movie, and they're inspired by these movies instead. So like, you know, if you want to just bring more people into your world, where can these people find these documentaries? How can they be a part of this process?
Well, In Search of Tomorrow is on sale for a limited time. If you go to 80sci-fi.com, you got to go between now and March 27th. As I said, we're a small company, so we manufacture in batches. And so we have to know how many we're going to manufacture. And so it's not like we manufacture a lot and distribute it to stores and have a big stockpile in a warehouse somewhere. It doesn't work that way for a small company. It's not economically sensible to do that. So right now, this is the only time you can get it. You can't get it on streaming. You can't get it at the store. You got to go to 80sci-fi.com. The cool thing is you get all sorts of cool perks, like you get your name in the credits. So you could look at that. I mean, people now who have gotten this early, they're all getting on social media saying, I am a part of making this a reality. And I'm proud to show this to my friends and my family and my dog, you know? So that's a super cool thing. And then you get, you know, the collectibles. You get, you know, 3 exclusive posters of amazing artwork for the film, and you know, a variety of other things. You could choose your DVD and your Blu-ray. You get a slipcase. You got your digital copy. You know, a variety of things. You check out the site and you can see what's going on. But you know, at the end of the day, if you go to the Twitter, you know, the Twitter handle, the Instagram handle, the Facebook handle of 80s Sci-Fi Doc, you get all the information. Up next after this, we've got In Search of Darkness coming up, In Search of Darkness 3. So if you go to 80s, sorry, I gave you 80s Sci-Fi Doc. Now you go to the same places, but 80s Horror Doc or 80shorrordoc.com. That's where you get all the information if you want to get in line to purchase In Search of Darkness 3, which I got to go because I got to make it. But that being said, no, we're in production on that, which is pretty cool. I mean, if I could ask you without like spoiling too much, you know, is there for each of you one particular thing that you really connected with for In Search of Tomorrow, you know, compared to the other stuff that, you know, In Search of Darkness, or just coming blind, not knowing what to expect?
So for me, I'm sorry to like take over, Danny, but like the Star Trek stuff is very important to me too, because as a kid, my parents would take me to the theaters. My mom has a story about how she went to go see The Wrath of Khan, and I was an infant, and I was crying. They had to take me out of the theater, and I just peed on her. So she always remembers me peeing on her at The Wrath of Khan. But I was going to say that those movies,
The Wrath
Star
of
Trek,
Pete, apparently.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So those movies meant a lot to me in particular, and I really like just hearing Nicholas Meyer talk about his approach to those movies and what he would have done for the search for Spock, and just like what those movies meant to the people involved. So I think it's that particular set of movies for me.
Mm-hmm.
It really felt like a time capsule. I had so many of these movies taped on VHS, like Explorers, Flight of the Navigator. Like it made me think about my dad passed away last year, and it just made me think about all the times my dad would take me to the video store and we would just rent these movies on repeat, and then he would tape them off TV whenever they would get on there. And then the other thing is just during the scene on the Abyss, during your section on the Abyss, my favorite subgenre of anything is anything that has to do with underwater. Jaws is my favorite movie. So anything, and like I saw on the poster in the background, you had like Lords of the Deep, Deep Star Six, Leviathan, and the Abyss, and I'm just like, that was maybe my favorite year of my childhood because I could rent an underwater horror or sci-fi movie every week and see all of this great stuff. So those, it also made me realize I have to rewatch The Abyss. It's been far too long. Great movie.
Thanks for sharing with the highlights for you guys. I think maybe I'll end on this and just say what I've recognized in the In Search of Darkness movies, and as much so in terms of how I approach all the movies here in Search of Tomorrow, is that these movies they transcend the movie itself. So this is a movie about not only movies, but an era and the advances of the era and the visions of the era. But all these movies, it's really about who you were with, what you were doing, why these movies were important to you, even if the movie itself wasn't that important or memorable.
Right.
You know, who you were with, what you were escaping from or escaping to in your life at the time. You know, how much of a deep dive you wanted to do before or after, and the memories of just doing what you could or getting a piece of it and a little souvenir for yourself, whether it was a soundtrack or a magazine or, you know, cutting out pictures from Starlog magazine and taping it to your bedroom door. You know, these are things I think all of us did in some way, shape, or form. And, you know, I think of Megaforce, and I think about not only seeing in the theater, but I think of every single comic book that had, you know, Ace Hunter, you know, deeds not words, pointing at you, giving the thumbs up. You know, that was as much about the hype of the film than the film itself, you know, which may or may not have delivered, you know. And I remember all that kind of stuff, and it just warms our hearts. It's just happy memories. And you can't discount what kids are experiencing today. They're experiencing things differently, but they're going to remember all this stuff in a whole different way. And gosh, the last 2 years, they're going to all have, they're all in the same boat. And so there's a whole generation that's going to be able to say, what were you doing when? Where they could just talk to a stranger and everyone knows what they're talking about. And they're going to have a point of reference to expand their discussions about what pop culture they consumed and what they did to just deal with the time where you couldn't go out and people around you were getting sick and things were upside down and crazy. And then we all thought we were out of it. Next thing you know, World War III is the next thing on the plate on their bingo card. So, you know, right? So that's, you know, we live in topsy-turvy, crazy times. And so I think it's always important to have one foot in reality to just make sure you know what's going on in the world. But I sure love to go back to the nostalgia of my youth, to disappear into my collectibles and my movies and my TV shows and my music that brought real joy to myself and have happy memories of the people in my life, whether they're here now or they're no longer with us. They're always in our hearts, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're making me think about In Search of TikTok, which is going to come out in 85. And it'll be 2022. Remember this? Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Cool, man. Yeah. Well, dude, as always, like I said, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. And we just love talking to you like every couple of months, it seems like. But it's like one of the highlights of doing this channel. So
definitely. Thank you so much for coming on again.